My name is Robert Sanderson, and last spring I found myself driving through the Missouri Ozarks. It wasn't a vacation. I was headed back from a sales trip to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and my boss had stressed the importance of a fast turnaround. But the interstate was jammed, a mess of brake lights and angry horns, so I took a detour. My phone showed a shortcut through something called the Mark Twain National Forest. Sounded scenic enough. I imagined winding roads, maybe a general store selling sarsaparilla and postcards. A nice break from the monotony. The first hour was pleasant. Some light filtered through the trees. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth. I rolled down the windows and cranked up the radio, some forgotten country song crackling through the speakers. Then the pavement ended. Just like that. 1 minute asphalt, the next a rough dirt track barely wide enough for my car. I cursed, considered turning back, but the sun was already dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. Besides, my boss's words echoed in my ears. Time is money, Sanderson. The deeper I drove, the denser the forest became. Trees pressed close to the road, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out the last rays of light. The air grew noticeably cooler. My phone buzzed. No signal. Great. Lost and alone. Then I saw it, a flicker of light through the trees. I slowed, straining to see through the gathering gloom. It looked like a fire, small and flickering off in the distance. Hope surged through me. Maybe a campsite, maybe civilization. I followed a barely discernible path through the undergrowth, the sound of my own footsteps loud in the stillness. The smell of wood smoke grew stronger, and I could hear voices now, low murmurs carried on the wind. The trees thinned, and I stumbled into a clearing. A fire burned merrily in a stone fireplace, casting a warm glow over a small log cabin. 2 figures sat hunched by the flames, their backs to me. I cleared my throat. "Hello there," I called out. "Mind if I share your fire? My car is stuck back there, and my phone's dead." The figures didn't move. I tried again. "Hello? Anybody home?" One of the figures slowly turned. It was a woman, her face hidden in the shadows. She didn't speak, just stared at me with unsettling intensity. "Everything all right?" I asked, a prickle of unease crawling up my spine. She slowly stood, revealing a figure tall and gaunt, her clothes ragged and dirty. I noticed now that her companion remained motionless, slumped against a rock. "My friend, he's not feeling well," the woman said, her voice a low rasp. "He needs help." I took a step closer, peering at the slumped figure. The light from the fire flickered momentarily, illuminating the man's face. His skin was an unnatural grayish white, his eyes vacant and staring. He wasn't breathing. "He's dead," I said, taking an involuntary step back. "You need to call the police." The woman took a step toward me. "No police," she hissed, her eyes suddenly burning with an unnerving light. "He just needs help." The way she said it sent a shiver down my spine. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. My gut screamed at me to get out of there. "I'm sorry," I said, backing away. "I can't help you. I'm leaving." I turned to run, but the woman moved with surprising speed, grabbing my arm. Her grip was like iron. "You don't understand," she hissed, her breath hot and foul on my cheek. "He needs you." I wrenched free and ran toward my car, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back, didn't slow down until I reached the relative safety of my locked car. My hands shook so badly I could barely find the key. I slammed the door shut and fumbled with the engine. The image of the dead man and the unsettling woman burned into my mind. The engine finally sputtered to life, and I threw the car into gear. The headlights briefly illuminated the clearing, catching the woman standing there, her face a mask of fury and disappointment. I didn't wait to find out. I drove through the night, fueled by adrenaline and fear. I didn't stop until I hit the outskirts of Springfield just as the sun began to rise. I pulled into a gas station, my body trembling, my mind racing. I told myself it was a crazy woman, probably high on meth, that the man had died of natural causes. But deep down, a chilling certainty settled over me. Something wasn't right. I called the police, reported the incident, described the clearing, the cabin, the woman. They took my statement, but I could tell they didn't believe me. Thought I was just another city slicker, spooked by the woods. I left Springfield, drove back to Kansas City, tried to put the whole thing behind me. But I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the nagging suspicion that I had stumbled onto something sinister. A few weeks later, I saw a news report about a string of missing persons in the Mark Twain National Forest. Hikers, campers, even a couple driving through on their way to Branson, all vanished without a trace. The police suspected foul play, but they had no leads, no suspects. I thought about calling them, telling them what I'd seen. But what good would it do? They wouldn't believe me. They'd probably think I was involved somehow. So I kept quiet, tried to forget, tried to move on. But the memory lingered, a dark stain on the edges of my thoughts. A year passed. I tried to avoid driving, sticking to well-populated areas, shying away from any reminder of that night. I switched jobs, got a therapist, started drinking more than I should have. Then, just when I thought I was finally moving on, I received a postcard. It was a picture of the Mark Twain National Forest. Sunlight filtered through the trees. It looked peaceful, serene. Scrawled in shaky handwriting was a single sentence: "He's still waiting." My blood ran cold. I went to the police again, showed them the postcard, told them everything. This time they took me a little more seriously. The missing persons case was still open, and my story, while bizarre, added another piece to the puzzle. They traced the postcard to a small town on the edge of the forest. The woman who sent it, they discovered, was the town recluse, a woman named Martha Jennings. Martha Jennings lived in a ramshackle house on the outskirts of town. The neighbors said she kept to herself, rarely spoke, and always had a strange, almost feral look in her eyes. They brought in a sketch artist, and the likeness he produced from my description was chillingly accurate. This wasn't some figment of my imagination. This woman was real. The police obtained a search warrant for Martha's house. I went with them. I don't know why. Maybe I thought seeing her again would bring some closure, some sense of peace. Martha's house was dark and dusty, the air thick with the smell of mildew and something else. Something metallic and cloying. The police searched the house, but they found no sign of Martha, no sign of any other victims. Just strange symbols drawn on the walls, what looked like blood, and a pile of bones hidden beneath the floorboards. Animal bones, the coroner confirmed. At least, most of them were. Just as we were about to give up, I noticed something in the backyard. A small, dilapidated shed stood half hidden in the overgrown weeds. The door creaked open on rusty hinges, revealing a dirt floor and a single wooden chair sitting in the center of the room. And on that chair, bound and gagged, was Martha Jennings. Her eyes were wide with fear, her gaze fixed on something behind me, something just outside my field of vision. She was mumbling, her words barely audible. "He's here," she whispered, her voice hoarse with terror. "He's come back for her." Sunlight slanted through the open doorway, dust motes dancing in the stillness. Martha's words hung in the air, heavy and thick like the humid Missouri air. "He's come back for her." My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I turned, slow, careful, like a man disarming a bomb. The other cops hadn't noticed, still focused on Martha bound in that chair, her eyes wide with a terror that made my gut clench. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, longer, deeper than it should be, stretching out from the back corner of the shed. But as my eyes adjusted, the shadow seemed to solidify. It was as if the darkness itself had taken on a form. It was big, easily the size of a man, but hunched low to the ground. Skin, if you could call it that, looked like rawhide stretched tight over bone, a patchwork of browns and sickly yellows. No hair, but something glinted along its back, sharp protrusions, like shards of broken glass. And the smell. God, the smell. Like rotten meat mixed with something else. Something acrid and ancient. Something that made my stomach churn. The thing moved then, a slow, sinuous glide. And I saw its eyes, blacker than the heart of a dying star. They fixed on me, and a wave of cold, primal fear washed over me, so intense it stole my breath. This was no animal. This was something else, something old and hungry. "Get back!" I yelled. The words ripped from my throat. The cops finally turned, their faces a mixture of confusion and disbelief. It was too late. The thing lunged, a blur of motion too fast for the eye to follow. I heard a scream, cut short, a sickening crunch. The air exploded with a flurry of limbs and shouts, the metallic tang of blood. Chaos. My hand instinctively went to my sidearm, but it felt 1,000 miles away. The world shrank to a tunnel vision of violence and fear. I heard myself shouting, but the words were lost in the roaring in my ears. The cops were firing, their pistols spitting fire and fury, but the bullets seemed to pass right through the creature, leaving only ripples in the air where it should be. It moved again, a whirlwind of teeth and claws. Another scream, choked off. A body hit the floor with a thud that resonated in the pit of my stomach. This was a massacre. My mind screamed at me to run, to get the hell out of this nightmare. But my feet were rooted to the spot. The world tilted on its axis, nausea rising in my throat. Then, as quickly as it began, it was over. Silence descended, heavy and thick. The air hung with the coppery scent of blood and the stench of that thing. I forced myself to breathe, each inhalation a shallow gasp. My gaze swept the shed floor, taking in the carnage. 2 cops down, their bodies twisted at unnatural angles. Martha Jennings still sat strapped to the chair, her eyes blank, a single tear tracing a clean path down her dust-streaked cheek. The creature was gone, vanished back into the shadows from whence it came. I stumbled back, leaning against the rough wood of the shed wall, my stomach threatening to rebel. My fingers cold comfort in the face of what? What the hell was that thing? My mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. The news reports, the missing people, Martha's postcard. It all clicked into place, a horrifying jigsaw puzzle. This wasn't some random act of violence. This was a hunt. And Martha, she wasn't a victim. She was bait. But for what? Later, much later, after the sirens had faded and the forensic teams had packed up their gruesome cargo, I sat alone in a sterile interrogation room. My head pounded. My throat felt coated in sandpaper. They asked questions I couldn't answer, wanted details I could barely remember. But when they asked about the creature, its appearance, its movements, a name forced its way past my lips. A whisper from some forgotten nightmare. The Rawhide Man, I said. The words tasted like ash in my mouth. They looked at me then, the same way the cops in Springfield had looked at me all those years ago. Like I was crazy. Like I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe they're right. Maybe it was all in my head. God knows I want to believe that. But as I drive away from the police station into the gathering dusk, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. And in the shadows that stretch out before me, I see a flicker of movement, a glimpse of something dark and hungry, something that knows my name. One time, while bow hunting in a tree stand, I had 3 bears walk under my stand right before dark. When I was ready to leave the stand, I yelled at the bears. One of the baby bears climbed up the double tree I was in and was looking down at me, chomping its teeth. I was afraid to leave the stand because the large mama bear was somewhere on the ground in the dark. This happened about an hour ago. It's night. I'm in my street-level apartment, lying on the sofa and reading the news on my cell. I hear a bike stop outside my house, and I see a guy walking up and down the street. I'm thinking it's probably some delivery guy who is searching for the right address, and I don't pay too much attention. A minute passes by, and I see that guy standing outside my yard, less than 10 meters from where I am. I sit up and ask him if he's searching for something and if he wants any help, without actually standing up or going outside, since it's hot and the windows are open so he can hear me. He politely replies, "No, thank you." So this time, I think he is waiting for someone, and I get back to reading the news. But I'm starting to feel that something isn't right. It's a bit dark outside. There is some light from the street lamp, so I can't really see which direction this guy is looking. However, I sense that he's looking inside my house. I decide to stand up, get a better look, and ask him to move and wait a bit further down the road for whoever he was waiting for. Only, the guy was not waiting for someone. He was just standing there, staring at me, and touching himself. I do not know what the normal reaction would be, Mine was shouting at him to go away, cursing him, and sending him to hell while simultaneously closing the shutters. Seconds later, I heard the bike leaving. I didn't feel afraid. I felt exposed, creeped out, and pissed. I am still very much pissed. Edit. First of all, thank you for your suggestions and your wishes for me to be safe. Secondly, there are a couple of things I didn't initially mention because they weren't pertinent to what happened. But now I feel I should add, as I am time limited and not able to respond to everyone one by one. I am European. We don't have a gun in the house mentality in my country, especially in the cities. The only people who have guns are the police and the criminals. In rural areas, the hunters too, but that's about it. We are also not accustomed to security cameras at home. I know no one who has one. I only see them in office buildings, banks, factories, and rich people's houses. We do all have the classic doorbell cameras, though, which, however, do not record. Moreover, I don't live alone. I live with my husband, who was here last night, but he was in his study doing some late-night work. I didn't call for him. I only told him what happened afterward, which is indicative of how not scared I was. As for the police, you are right about creating a trail. This is a reason why I should report it. Lastly, I luckily didn't see his penis. He was grabbing and touching it on top of his trousers. It was the standing in the dark, staring part that creeped me out more than the genitals part. Looking for housing on Craigslist. Perhaps my worst idea yet. Here's how the worst of it went down. Me. Hi. Is the room you have advertised still available? Yes, I am available. I'm a brown-haired, brown-eyed male, 190 pounds, 6'2", physically very fit, funny, and very witty. Me. Okay, that's nice. I'm a single male. Hope you don't mind. I'm a good man, and I've always respected the ladies. I don't care that you're single or male. I'm just looking for a room. Is the one in the ad still available? How much is rent? May I see some pictures of the place? You don't have to be a. Send me a picture of yourself wearing something sexy. Are you a non-smoker? You don't really need pictures, but I'll only send one if you send me one of yourself. It'll be like a game. This isn't going to work out. But you don't understand. I love the ladies. I only blame myself for expecting more from this community. Probably 6 or 7 years ago, I bought a phone from a guy on Craigslist and used it for a good solid month or two. I rooted it, modded it, got bored with it, and decided to sell it. One of the very first people to respond to the ad was the cousin of the guy I bought it from. I found this out after the fact. Anyway, the guy offered me the asking price, and then he started offering me more money, assuring me he would secure the phone. It was a little weird, but I wasn't going to turn down money if he was going to give it to me. So we met up to complete the sale, and he started checking over the phone. I could tell something wasn't right, so I asked for my phone back and tried to take it out of his hand. He resisted, punched me in the face, and took off running. I never got my phone back because I can't run for see. Turns out the guy I met up with was going around meeting people to buy their phones and then robbing them. It all finally ended when he held up a couple with a young kid in the back seat at gunpoint for all of their belongings. They drove up to a store a block or so away from where it all happened and called the cops. The main guy and an accomplice were picked up a little later and admitted to the whole thing, plus other robberies. He ended up doing 3 to 5 years or something like that. And I got some money back for the lost property. No idea, but I'm freaked out. To start, I know a decent amount about things like this, and I have a general idea of what they can look and act like. Today, I woke up and it had just turned 4 a.m., so I headed downstairs to get some water and smoke a cigarette on my back patio. Typically, my grandmother's dogs do not follow me or even really pay attention to me at all. But tonight, as I'm on my back patio, both of them follow me outside. Then they freeze in their tracks. There is a corner between the garage door and the fence of my backyard, and my bedroom window is just over the garage door, about 14 feet off the ground, I'd say. My dogs are frozen in place and just staring hard at this corner. Then I begin to get that sinking feeling in my stomach, that I'm being watched. My dogs haven't moved from staring at this corner, and I've only been outside for around 5 minutes at this point, so I start staring at this corner too. There is a tree right up against the fence in this corner, and I am very familiar with how it looks at night. But tonight, it looked off. I can kind of make out what looks like a person's head with where their eyes would be, just level with my window. The second I notice this, my dogs absolutely lose their minds, barking at what I thought was nothing. These are dogs that typically don't bark, not even at neighbors or postmen. At this point, I can clearly see that something is standing in this corner, looking into my window, or at me. I went inside, brought my dogs with me, and made sure to shut the door and draw the blinds completely over it. They haven't stopped barking. I go upstairs and pretend that I heard and saw nothing. But as I look at my window, I can see the top of the head I mentioned earlier, just at the corner of my window, where typically there is nothing because of how high off the ground it is. It's too dark for me to clearly capture anything on camera, but I am very sure of what I saw. I live in Texas at the edge of an urban area that they have only started expanding onto in the last 10 years. From the front of my house, it used to be miles of apple orchards and fields. And for the most part, it still is fields. But now they've started building houses here. I find this strange only because it's such an urban area. But I know there's no 14-foot people walking around peering into windows. I can't say for sure what it could be or was. I only know what I saw. I've had previous experiences with things like this when I lived out in Oregon and rural Ohio as a kid, and only once or twice living in semi-wooded areas in the panhandle of Florida. If anyone has any ideas or speculations on this, I would love to hear it. But for now, I'm going to pretend this didn't happen and hopefully get some clarity on it, especially with all this alien talk happening right now. Hopefully, this is the right place to post about it. It happened when I was in high school, either May 6, 2015 or 2016. My best friend at the time, our two guy friends, and I went to a small concert and decided to go to a residential park afterward to chill and smoke a little weed. This was in Huntington Beach, California, in a pretty wealthy suburban residential area. We sat at a bench and were just hanging out and chatting like normal teenagers. No alcohol, heavy drugs, or psychedelics were involved at all. It was a pretty large park. There was a soccer field right in front of us, and behind it was a hill that led to a residential neighborhood on top. This part is really important later. Since there were no lights behind the soccer field, the hill was really dark and hard to see. All of a sudden, we saw 4 orange lights trailing back and forth in an S shape down the hill. There was a sound that resembled almost like a dinosaur or animalistic snarl or something. We assumed it was the cops, so we started to stand up and back away from the benches toward our car. We were stalling to see what was coming toward us. As they came into the lights of the soccer field, we saw about 5 or 6 people in black, hooded cloaks walking side by side in unison. They were also playing some eerie music from a stereo or something. All of them formed a circle, and one of them came into the middle of the circle, took off his cloak, was naked, and started hitting and slapping his chest really hard. I remember him being bald, very pale, and hitting his chest so hard that it was leaving pink marks on his skin. Then he blew a horn of some sort, which made that sound that resembled an animal's snarl. Then all of them turned around, looked at us in unison, and started sprinting toward us. I started to run, but for some reason, my friends weren't really running at all. Then they started getting really close, and we all panicked and ran into our cars. Once we were in our cars, they all had lined up on the sidewalk, looking toward our cars, then turned around in unison and walked away down into the park. My friends and I parked our cars facing each other and called each other on the phone to talk about what happened. We assumed it was some kids from HB High School, which they nicknamed Heroin High, because there are very interesting characters that attend that high school. We ended up just staying in the car for a couple of hours, talking and trying to process that whole situation. 2 hours passed, and it may have been 1 or 2 a.m. Out of nowhere, some sort of giant aircraft came out of nowhere and was flying above the neighborhood, over the top of the hill. It looked like what a UFO would look like. I had never seen anything like it before. All of us were in shock. I looked over to our friends in the other car, and all our jaws were dropped. We didn't say a word to each other. It wasn't one of those moments where someone sees a UFO hundreds of miles away in the sky for a couple of seconds, then it just disappears. This UFO was just hovering above this neighborhood for at least a minute or two, long enough and close enough for me to roll down my window and stick my head out to study it. I remember the noise of the machinery too. I remember seeing 3 red lights and 3 blue lights spinning in circles as it was hovering. I remember trying to study the whole aircraft and trying to remember all the details. Then it descended down into the neighborhood and just disappeared. And I emphasize, this was a suburban neighborhood in Huntington Beach. There's no landing pad, there's no airport, there's just nothing that would allow any planes or aircraft to land or take off. It just descended and disappeared. We waited until 4 a.m. to see if anything would happen after, but nothing did. We just went home afterward and went to sleep. The next day, I did some research, and from what I can remember, May 6th was Walpurgis Night, which is a pagan holiday. I tried to see if there were UFO sightings, and I remember seeing an article of someone reporting a UFO in Singapore or somewhere in Asia with similar red and blue lights. Could these two things somehow be correlated? I recently reconnected with my friend, and we got to chat about it years after it happened, and our stories are still the same. I ran into one of the guys a few years ago at In-N-Out Burger. I literally just called his name, we made eye contact, and I said, "Do you remember me?" He said yes, then said my name. And all I said to him afterward was, "That day, that was real, right? I'm not crazy." And he immediately replied, "That was real." We exchanged smiles, he grabbed his food, and left. Could anyone provide any clarity on this? It happened so long ago, and I kind of just suppressed the memory, but it was very much real, and I'm finally searching for answers. Let me know. Thanks so much. A bit taller than a Barbie doll, creatures that look human. And though they may be wild, they are well-dressed, akin to the styles of the 1700s or 1800s. Several years ago, I clearly watched a well-dressed young man slide down a bit of old house siding at the back of my yard, trying to escape my attention. He left a skid mark in the dirt that my intelligent husband couldn't explain away as a mouse or chipmunk. There were bipedal shoe marks, footprints, also left behind. And though my husband was a firm skeptic, he later had his own clear sighting of a well-dressed little man who was older and looked similar to the one I had seen. We don't know what to call these people, but I'd like to find a specific forum in which to discuss them. Currently, I'm concerned about the hard heat wave we are about to experience. I added water sources in the yard or garden tonight and tried to express the situation aloud to them. I can only hope my little neighbors benefit from my efforts. But I would like to discuss such things with others who know about them and care to share our world. I assume this forum is a place to post real observations and concerns with trust. Where do I go? Where do we turn? Because we know these folks are here without a doubt. We want to be good neighbors and would like to connect with others who make such efforts to learn what they like, need, want, dislike, etc. This is in north central Indiana, USA. Sightings are infrequent, but ongoing. My husband swears he recently sighted 2 little men while backing out the car, but when he turned to look directly, there were only 2 robins. He's also seen them shift into squirrels. He's not teasing or joking. He 100% believes what he saw, as do I with my own sightings. This happened around 1990 in southeast Michigan. Twice I saw a tall, black, humanoid-shaped figure that ran like the wind and appeared to almost fly across the ground. Both times it was dark out, and both times it scared the hell out of me and the friend I was with. Two different friends, one at the first sighting and another at the second. They both saw it too. Back up about 4 years before I saw this creature. A friend of mine was killed riding a mini bike. My brother and I were getting cryptic phone calls from someone our age who wouldn't tell us his name. I can't remember what he'd talk about, but it was really creepy. One day I hung up the phone and my brother asked who it was. I told him the person wouldn't say. My brother guessed it was the kid that died. Then in 2022, I went to see a movie, and man, did it give me chills. Nothing bad ever happened to me or my friends or the town, but besides that, we experienced the same thing as West Virginia did in the movie. Anyone else experienced this before? I've lived in the same Midwest or Great Lakes state my whole life. This story is actually my earliest memory, and I'm looking for some insight. Sorry for the length, also unsure if this is the right flair, since I've never posted on Reddit, just scrolled. I was very, very young, 2 or 3 years old. One day my mom was baking a cake. I ran into the kitchen to see the cake being pulled from the oven. I'm not sure if it's relevant, but in my memory of this, I was basically astral projecting. Like I saw myself run into the kitchen. When I reached the oven, I zoomed back into my body, and being an excited toddler, I put my hands on the hot oven. After crying and sitting on the couch with my hands in a bowl of water, I calmed down and started walking down the hallway to my parents' room. The lights were off, and as I was walking, I saw something peeking from behind the door. It looked almost like a really messed up version of Dobby from Harry Potter, with huge pointy ears and massive eyes. It was stark white, almost glowing. I was a little scared, but for some reason, I said hello to it. It hissed at me, and I ran away. Now, I would have ignored all of this if I hadn't had recurring dreams about it for the next decade. A few times a year, I would have this dream, and the details would change, but I always knew it was going to be the dream, because I had this horrible feeling of dread every time. But I couldn't wake up. The goblin would disguise itself as either one of my cats or a stuffed animal, and then suddenly transform and strangle me. I would wake up feeling like something had really choked me in real life. The dream stopped after I was 12 or 13. I'm not sure why. I have other normal memories of that house, all that my parents have confirmed, even what show I was watching that day. When I told my mom about all this years later, she dismissed it as my twisted memory of one of our cats. But neither of the cats ever hissed at me without reason, and they were very sweet cats. I'm 21 now and still don't know what to think. This happened in the Sierra Nevadas, in Yosemite Valley, California. It was a place I'd been looking forward to hiking for a long time. I had prepared all my gear the previous night, double-checking everything. Water, food, tent, map. I was just itching to get out there and explore. The sun was peeking up over the horizon. It was just so serene. A few hours into the hike, I stopped to refuel and take a breather. I found a nook near a stream and was settling down to eat when I heard a sound. At first, I thought it was probably a squirrel or something, but then the sound got louder and heavier. Suddenly, I was on alert. I'm no stranger to wildlife, and I instantly knew this was different. I could just feel it in my gut, so I decided to move toward it and check it out. I tread lightly, trying to find the source of the sound. Then I saw this creature. It wasn't a bear, not a mountain lion, not anything you'd expect to see in the mountains. It was something different. This creature stood on its hind legs like a human, but was much taller. The body was covered in scales, large ones, almost like armor plating. It was dark green, nearly black in some places. Its limbs were muscular, but lean, like a runner's, only way more powerful. The head was the most striking part, slanted, almond-shaped eyes that glowed an eerie yellow. It didn't have a snout, more like a flat face with slits where a nose should be. The mouth was filled with sharp, jagged teeth, not like a predator's teeth, more like rows of serrated knives. I didn't see any wings or anything, but it had a long tail, almost as long as its body, like a kangaroo's tail. It had 4 fingers, long and ending in sharp, curved claws. The thing I remember most was how smoothly it moved, like water flowing over rocks. Almost graceful. You're probably thinking I'm pulling your leg, but I swear this is exactly what I saw. This reptilian-like creature was some next-level, out-of-this-world kind of being. I had a good 5 minutes or so to just stare at it. It stood there at the edge of the clearing, just observing me, like it was trying to figure me out. It didn't seem hostile. I mean, it was freaky as hell, and I didn't want to provoke it, but instead of coming at me, it mirrored me. It was like we were doing some weird kind of dance. I know it sounds nuts, but it was as if the creature was just as curious about me as I was about it. We stood there for what felt like hours, but I'm sure it was just minutes. At one point, I could swear it made a low hum or something. I couldn't make much of it, but it didn't seem threatening. Then, suddenly, it turned and disappeared. I was in shock. What did I just witness? There I was, alone in the clearing, heart pounding like a drum. I decided to follow where the creature went. I couldn't just let it go. As I moved closer, I noticed huge tracks on the ground, nothing like I'd ever seen in any guidebook. The air felt different too, almost electric, charged. There was this energy I just can't explain. I pushed through the undergrowth, following the tracks. It felt like I was in some kind of dream or movie. At any moment, I expected to wake up back in my tent. But no, this was real. Eventually, the tracks became harder to find, then they disappeared. It was like the creature had just vanished into thin air. I must have searched for over an hour, but there was no other sign. It was gone. Every time I closed my eyes that night, I could still see those eyes. Its form was burned into my memory. I still can't believe what I saw. I'm in my early 30s now, but this happened back when I was a teen. Back when TVs still had the big back portion to hide all the components, just to give some time reference. Anyway, this happened in a desert city in California that used to be a small town. It's grown a lot since then. My brother and I were in our mother's bedroom watching TV. The TV was right in front of the window, so we could see outside. All of a sudden, this black humanoid thing came slowly drifting across the sky. The only reason I say it was humanoid is because I could see the shape of its legs. Even though it was in the sky, I could see the human shape, like a man on a jetpack. The weird thing is, once it passed over the house and into the distance, that's when I really started to process what I had seen. I didn't know if my brother had seen it too, so without explaining anything, I just turned to him and said, "Did you just see that?" And my brother said, "Yeah." WTF was that? I told him it looked like a man in the sky, right? And he said, "Yeah." We never knew what it was, only that it looked like a man slowly hovering and moving through the sky. It must have been a pretty tall figure for us to see the human shape it had while in the sky. Nothing happened for around 3 years, so I went into the woods. Suddenly, there was a deafening silence, and then a soothing voice appeared, one I had never heard before, and that voice said, "Come out to play." I just thought, no way. By this point, I was totally freaked out, so I ran faster than I ever had before. But suddenly, something stepped out in front of me that will mentally scar me forever. There it was, with the head of a dog, just 2 times larger than normal, and horns curved down over its face. Its muscular arms stretched down to its knees. But the most freaky thing was that it was not talking the way it normally did. It spoke in that soothing voice, but its mouth stayed closed. Then it opened its mouth and lurched at me. Suddenly, something ran out from behind a bush, and whatever it was, the creature took after it. I was never more petrified. The adrenaline carried me out of there at the speed of light. When I got out of the woods, I looked back, but it was not giving chase. Still, I sprinted home. I haven't seen that thing since, and I hope I never do. I hope it never got anyone. Never say it was just a story. Keep your eyes open when you're in the woods, day or night. To this day, I still don't know what it was. I don't think I ever will. Hi there. I'm Mo, and I'm 23 years old. I used to live in Canada until this encounter. This is my scary story. Even though I didn't see any creepy monsters, I still think this story is worth sharing. I was 16 at the time and had been in high school for about 3 months. After the spring break, I really didn't see any monsters or anything. Well, I guess I kind of did, but not in the way you're expecting. I was always a huge fan of vampire and werewolf books. In fact, I sometimes imagined some of the hot boys as werewolves. One day, I was heading to math class when one of the school bullies came over to me. Gabriel was one of the most intimidating kids in our school. "Hey there," he said, approaching me. I couldn't believe that he was actually talking to me. "Hi," I said, trying to get by him. Gabriel wouldn't let me go past him. "Do you want to go to prom with me?" he asked. I looked at him in disbelief. "Are you serious?" I asked, smiling. He nodded and took my hand. I was honestly very happy about this. Gabriel and I walked to math class together. After math class, we both went to our next classes. I had biology, and Gabriel had science. The day flew by until my last class. When I first arrived, I took my spot and began to open my book when our teacher made an announcement. "We have a new student," Professor Burke said. After that, a tall boy with black hair and blue eyes waved to the class. "Care to introduce yourself?" Professor Burke asked. The boy seemed to be very nervous. I'm Keith," he said with a soft voice. Professor Burke smiled at Keith and sent him to a seat. I couldn't help but look at him every now and then. He was quite good looking. After school, I walked home. Once I got home, I kicked off my shoes and looked at the calendar. "Prom is tomorrow," I cried. I honestly wasn't that excited for prom. I went up to my room and began digging through my closet for the fanciest dress I could find. Finally, I made up my mind and chose a black dress with roses on it. I then went down to the living room and turned on the TV. Right as I was about to choose a channel, the doorbell rang. I know I was 16, but still I felt strange being home alone. My dad would be home soon. Again, the doorbell rang. I sighed and walked over to the door. When I opened it, I was surprised to see the new kid standing there. He waved at me and smiled. "Hi," he said with the same soft voice. "What are you doing here?" I asked. "Professor Grant said you played," Keith said, pulling a guitar out from behind him. "Yeah, I do," I said enthusiastically. I opened the door wider for him to come inside. After a little while of playing with him, I finally decided to ask about the small red pick with his name on it. "It's the last thing my mom gave me before she died," Keith said, turning it over. I gently touched his hand and looked at the pick. Keith then said he needed to go, so I let him outside and closed the door. After he left, I finally had the chance to sit down and watch something before my dad got home. There was the secret knock on the door that told me my dad was home. After helping him with the groceries, I decided it was time for bed after I ate. The next day was exciting, until Gabriel decided to call it quits shortly after the dance had started. I went home and decided to sleep. I broke up with Gabriel shortly after I discovered that he was betting on me. Wednesday became my favorite day because that's when I saw Keith the most. Okay, I'll admit it. At the time, I had a huge crush on Keith. It was Wednesday night, and when I arrived home, I noticed that my father was there. "Hi, Dad," I said, dropping my bag on the floor. He nodded at me. I quickly did my chores and hurriedly fetched my guitar. "Someone's in a hurry," Dad said. My father didn't know about Keith yet, so I had to tell him. "Well, Professor G assigned me to play guitar with a boy," I explained. Dad looked at me, raising an eyebrow. "Not a boy your age, right?" he asked skeptically. "He's my age," I said, half smiling. Before my dad could reply, the bell rang. I ran to the door and opened it. Keith stood there, smiling like he always did. "Hi, Mo," he said, walking inside. I heard Dad get off the couch in the other room. "Act normal," I told Keith. He looked at me confused, but didn't say anything. Once he noticed my dad had come into the room, he smiled at him. "It's nice to meet you," Keith said, shaking my father's hand. "It's a pleasure," Dad said simply. After they were done, Keith headed upstairs to wait in my room. I was about to head upstairs when Dad wanted to talk to me. "He seems nice," Dad said. I nodded and tried heading to the stairs. "Mo, just be careful and don't give him what he wants." "What do you mean?" I asked. Dad strained for words. "You know what I mean," he said. I ignored this and headed up the stairs. I got to the top and went into my bedroom, where Keith was sitting on my bed watching something on his phone. Once he noticed I was there, he put his phone down and opened his guitar case. He pulled out his red Jaguar and put the strap over his shoulder. I watched him play his part of the song and then joined in. After we finished, Keith stayed for a little while. We watched some stuff on his phone. After he put it down, I couldn't believe what happened next. Keith gently pulled me closer to him and pressed his lips to mine. After quite the makeout, I started undoing the buttons on his shirt, still kissing him. I finally got the last button undone, but he pulled away. "I can't do this to you," he said, grabbing my hands away from his shirt. "What do you mean?" I asked, watching him stand up. "You have to promise not to tell anyone," he said gravely. I nodded and watched him crouch. He went down on his knees and looked up at me. "Fine, I'm not human," he said. I waited for the pun, but it didn't come. "You're joking," I said. He shook his head. "Prove it," I said, knowing there was no physical way. He looked away from me, and then when he looked back, his eyes were flaming. I almost shrieked, but he shushed me. His eyes returned to normal. "Just don't tell anyone," he said, kissing me again. "I'm sorry, but I can't be with you," he said, looking ashamed. I nodded and looked away. Keith got up from his knees and walked out the door. I followed him and watched him leave. Little did I know that was going to be the last time I saw him. The next day at school, I waited for him in science class, but he didn't show up. After school, I was miserable and missed him. But when the doorbell rang, I shot up. I opened the door, but no one was there. I looked around and shrieked when I noticed something was terribly wrong. There was a bloody hand with Keith's pick. There's no way this was him, right? There was a bloody trail that led into the forest, so I followed it. This must have been a prank. I ran into the forest, following the bloody trail. I reached where the trail ended and found Keith, although he looked horrible. I began to sob when I saw his body, shredded to pieces. I never told anyone this story. It still appears in my dreams. I fear that if I told anyone, they would think I'm crazy. We explained what we saw to Jamie and our chauffeur, and they both became noticeably uncomfortable. We were so freaked out that we ended up staying inside, playing cards, working on written assignments for badge requirements, and talking about random nonsense to distract ourselves. The rest of that evening, we all slept restlessly. When we finally went to bed that night, I couldn't fall asleep for what seemed like hours because I was paranoid that someone or something was looking at us through the cabin windows. We packed up and left early the next morning. I spoke to the other girls in the car ride on the way home, and they had all felt a sense of being watched the night before, too. Needless to say, that was the last time any of us ever went to Camp Tay. On the bright side, at least I didn't get hives this time. Unfortunately, our troop kind of fell apart after that. We just didn't have the motivation to continue anything camping related, or even general scout related. We all got our silver awards at the end of 8th grade, and then left Girl Scouts at the beginning of high school. I'm just thankful that none of us were harmed or horribly mentally scarred from this experience, which could have potentially turned out dangerous or even deadly. I'm 24 now and still keep in touch with Eva, Courtney, Jamie, and Kira. I'm happy to report that we're all doing great and haven't had any more run-ins with strange creatures, eviscerated animals, or ghosts. Jamie and Eva are both married and have become a teacher and a physical therapist, respectively. Kira is an amazing artist and earns a living from her art commissions. Courtney is an extremely talented professional horse trainer. I've since moved to Oregon and am continuing my education to earn a PhD in wildlife biology so I can continue learning about and helping the wild animals and plants I love so much. I'm studying the relationship between native amphibian health and agricultural practices in the Pacific Northwest for my thesis, if anyone is curious. And who knows, maybe I'll encounter another strange, unexplainable occurrence in the woods. Maybe I'll meet Bigfoot, or maybe I'll even find some answers to what exactly happened at Camp Tay. But all in all, these two experiences are why I can't consider myself to be 100% a skeptic. I have absolutely no explanation for either of them. I have researched plants, animals, fungi, local legends, even mental conditions that could cause hives or such intense fear and paranoia, and have never found any answers that make sense. At best, it's a fun ghost story to tell friends and acquaintances. At worst, there is some unknown, horrifying creature or spirit living in the forests of western Missouri, tearing apart animals and terrorizing those who venture too far into the woods. Almost every month, my boyfriend and his friends and I go up to Pack, Arizona for a fun weekend camping trip. Most of the time, things have been normal. His friends usually opt to sleep on the ground in a big tent together, while he and I sleep on an inflatable mattress in the back of his truck. One camping trip, everyone decided to bring their dogs. There were about 5 or 6 dogs at the campsite. When we got there, we set up the campground, put the tent up, tied up the dogs, etc. But it wasn't long before one of the dogs started whining and complaining. We figured it was just a normal response to being in a new place and outside. Eventually, we started cooking dinner, and the sun went down. I started to feel a little tired when I noticed that one of our shepherd mixes was freaking out. I walked over to her to calm her down, assuming she might have gotten tangled up in her leash again. Sure enough, she was tangled. I helped her out, but she continued to whine and pretty much choke herself on her collar trying to move away from a part of the woods. I took her leash off and managed to drag her back to the campsite so she might feel safer with everyone around. She eventually calmed down, but her gaze was constantly on one part of the woods. Everyone ate, and I decided to go to bed early with the dog while the guys had beers and did guy things. I got both of our dogs into the back of the truck bed, opened up the camper windows so some airflow could come in, and eventually climbed in myself. I was out like a light that night. Nothing weird happened to me. My boyfriend recalls that when I went to bed, he was just chilling outside with his buddies when a stick snapped to the left of our campsite. Everyone stopped what they were doing and pulled out their guns. Someone shined a flashlight into the part of the woods where the snap had come from. There was nothing. They went back to what they were doing when one of his buddy's dogs started violently barking. His friend calmed his dog down and pulled him closer to the campsite. That's when someone noticed the entire woods seemed to deafen. There was no sound besides the crackling of the campfire. Everyone grabbed their dogs and shuffled them into one of the tents to keep them from running away. My boyfriend and his friend both searched the outside of the campsite. They found nothing. When they got back to the fire, the sounds of the woods came back to life. Everyone assumed a mountain lion or bear had just passed by or something. Eventually, my boyfriend hopped into the truck bed with me, and we fell asleep. His buddies went into their tent, which was to the right of the truck. In the morning, we regrouped, and one of his buddies asked if anybody had heard weird sounds in the middle of the night. Everyone said no, and we just shrugged it off as him being paranoid. The day went on. We mostly just chilled at the campsite, cooked food, and made s'mores. One of the guys, B, and another, T, decided they wanted to go on a short walk. They hadn't been gone more than an hour when they came running back to camp. B instantly puked after they stopped. T looked like he had seen a ghost. After B sat down, everyone gathered around and asked what the heck had happened. T said they had been walking through the forest when B stopped to take a leak behind a tree. T turned his back to B to give him privacy. T said he then heard something rustling in the trees above him. He looked up and saw a squirrel's nest, but he was confused because there were no squirrels, just noise. He turned slightly to yell back at B to ask if he was rustling around in the leaves or brush nearby. B said no and eventually finished. B said he was ready to continue when T turned around and saw a shadowy figure about 200 feet behind B. T gasped and told B not to turn around. B laughed and told him if he was trying to start a joke, he wasn't falling for it. T yelled at B to tell him it wasn't a joke, just as the woods went dead silent again, and T got whacked in the back of the head with a rock. T screamed and started running back to camp. B, confused and assuming it was a prank, ran after T. As T was running, B heard a low growl behind him and ran faster. They both managed to get away. I was terrified. I had always believed in everything supernatural or mythological. My boyfriend, R, told everyone we should move the campsite closer together so that if anything went south, we'd be able to get out quickly. I jumped out of my chair and started loading up the cars with anything valuable we wouldn't want to abandon. R thought I was being paranoid. After everything was moved and the dogs were all placed in kennels, we started dinner. I was very cold that night, even though the sun was still out. So I told R I was heading back into the truck bed to stay shielded from the cold and wind. I took both our shepherd mixes into the back as well. I watched from the truck bed with the tailgate closed and the camper top open. The fire was no less than 15 feet away, so I didn't feel too isolated. T's fiancée decided to do the same as me and took their dog into the back of their SUV. The sun started to go down, and B eventually needed to take a leak again. One of the guys, O, teased B and asked if he needed a battle buddy. B flipped him off and went behind the closest tree to camp where nobody could see him. I whispered to R that I thought I heard something in the distance and that I was getting very scared. He kissed me and assured me he'd keep me and the dog safe. B came back from taking a leak when T's fiancée screamed. She pointed behind B with her hand over her mouth. That's when I saw it, and I hoped everyone else did too. 2 bright yellow eyes were behind B. A chill ran down my entire body. The eyes were at least a foot taller than B. My boyfriend jumped up, told B to duck, and fired 4 rounds into what he hoped was the creature's body. B dropped to the ground and crawled on his hands and knees to the campfire. I saw the eyes fade away after R shot. Not a minute later, I felt the truck get pushed hard on the left side, like someone had slammed into it. I screamed, and R rushed over. He closed the camper door and aimed his pistol down the side of the truck. T's fiancée locked herself in the SUV while T rushed to get their other dog and stuff into it. O and F were packing everything up quickly and dumping it into the back of O's truck. I quieted the dogs while R checked around the truck and found nothing. He yelled through the camper vent that we were getting out of there. B rushed into the back seat of our truck with his 2 dogs. O and F were grabbing the last of the firewood when a low growl started from behind the big tent. R yelled for everyone to get the heck out. He started the truck and pulled off. T and his fiancée were behind us, and O and F behind them. As we drove away, I saw the campfire extinguish and the woods turn pitch black. We didn't stop until we reached the Walmart parking lot in Pack. O and F said whatever that thing was had left 3 gashing scratches in their tailgate. Sure enough, 3 huge chunks of metal had been ripped out. O said their car almost ran off the side of the road and they thought they were goners. T's fiancée was sobbing and shaking to the point she could only utter 1 word at a time. I was terrified too. We got at least 2 dogs into each vehicle. I climbed into the front seat of the truck with R as we started back to Phoenix. He looked over and apologized. I was confused. Then he said he had encountered something at that campsite before, but it hadn't gotten as bad as this time. I asked him what it was. He shook his head and said, "Whatever it was, it's not going to ever see me again." We haven't gone back to that specific spot since. The last time we went camping, we just went to a KOA up in Flagstaff. It wasn't as fun as being out in the woods, but I was happy I didn't have to worry about any weird creatures. So, the next time you're in the woods of Pack, Arizona, make sure you have a gun on you. I'm not sure if we would have made it out of there alive if we hadn't been prepared. My story takes place in the southern Appalachian Mountains of Oconee County, South Carolina, in the summer of 2015. I grew up hiking and camping in this area and continued that tradition in my spare time from my day job as a geologist. As a hobby, I take pictures and write articles for an online outdoor publication. I often ask around for tips on interesting places and subjects for my articles. A friend introduced me to an elderly native gentleman who was known for his knowledge of the area and storytelling charm. The gentleman agreed to meet me for coffee one morning at a local diner. I found his company delightful and informative. We spoke for nearly 2 hours, and I took copious notes on the many stories he revealed. The tale I found most intriguing concerned a long-abandoned home place far off the beaten path, up near the Georgia border. The property, I was told, included the ruins of an old house and a family cemetery. The story also involved a spooky ghost story, complete with family tragedy, cursed land, and such. As a man of science, I knew the story was superstitious hokum, added over the years to spice up the tale. In any case, the old gentleman gave me information I felt was sufficient to help me locate the place. Deciding to give the effort 2 days, I set off just before dawn on Saturday morning, accompanied by my big rescue mutt, Shan. The weather was glorious, with a filigree of sunlight to light my path and just enough breeze to offer some relief from the South Carolina heat that reaches even the highest mountains this time of year. We made good time the first day. On my pre-mapped search area, we had come up empty by the time the sun descended below the mountains. The natural beauty and unique energy of these ancient mountains made this trip worth it, even if we never found the old home place. Shan's boundless energy compelled me to continue on longer than I usually would, but not wanting to wander in the darkness, I decided to start looking for a good place to set up camp for the evening. After a few minutes of searching, I was relieved to find a promising clearing in the heavily wooded forest. As we approached, I recognized the unmistakable outline of a decaying brick chimney. We had found the old home place. This is when things began to get weird. As I explored the area and searched for the old cemetery, I noticed that no trees grew in the clearing, and there was only sparse, sickly-looking vegetation on the property, surrounded by the deep green forest. That was strange, but I didn't give it much thought. Plants were not my specialty. Presently, I noticed that Sean was nowhere to be seen. He customarily stayed close by my side and never wandered out of sight. I retraced my steps and found him standing at the tree line, just outside the clearing. He stood in a crouched, ready position, staring at the old ruins with laser focus, as if sensing a threat. This behavior was far from his customary happy-go-lucky personality. He was a big boy, nearly 100 pounds, and he never showed fear in the woods. I had never seen him like this. Of course, I figured he smelled some strange wildlife and didn't know what to make of it. I went back to searching the area and soon found a few rusted metal crosses the family had used to mark the graves. I took out my camera and began delightedly taking pictures of such a compelling sight. After about 10 minutes of this, I stopped to take a drink from my canteen and noticed Sean had still not joined me. I walked back toward the tree line and saw that this time he was pacing nervously along the edge of the clearing, being careful to stay back among the trees. I called him, but he refused to come any closer and began bouncing on his feet as if to coax me to come to him. I took a quick look around the property again, but saw nothing that might cause Sean to act this way. As it was beginning to get dark, I found a suitable place to camp at the edge of the woods, and this seemed to satisfy him. I gave him his dog food and a chew bone and cooked my meal over the little camp stove I carried. The night was cool, and the woods were beautiful. As I began to relax and drift off, I decided to forgo the tent and just camp outside. Shan lay down beside me and seemed perfectly content. I had taken some great pictures, had good material for my article, and was enjoying the mountains I loved so much. All this added up to a very successful trip. I soon fell into a deep and restful sleep with my buddy at my side. In the wee hours, I popped awake when I felt Sean jump up suddenly. His ears were up, and he was facing the old house with the same laser focus he had shown earlier. The night was clear enough, and the moon shone dim light over the whole clearing. The old house was maybe 15 yards up the hill, and the cemetery was just adjacent to our campsite, no more than 10 yards away. As soon as I sat up and looked around, I heard what sounded like a child or a woman crying, coming from the direction of the old house. I jumped up, took a few steps out of the woods onto the property to get a better perspective. I saw nothing, but at this point, the sound of crying was unmistakable. It gave me a creepy shiver, but I was an absolute non-believer in anything paranormal. "Hello?" I called. No response. The crying tapered to a low whimper, and I heard the quiet murmur of a male voice. I was convinced that some people had wandered up and might need some help. I looked toward the camp to see Sean still frozen in place. Of course, there was a reasonable explanation for these voices. It was just people, right? As I began walking up the hill toward the old house, I admit that I was starting to feel uneasy. Something just seemed off or unnatural. I began to regret not bringing my flashlight. I thought about going back for it, but I decided to head up the hill and clear this up. The moonlight was bright enough that I would be able to see anyone who was there. Of the old house, there only remained the chimney, a rough slab floor, and a few rotten timbers strewn around. Nowhere to hide. None. There, I could clearly hear the voices. The people should be right here, but nobody was. My skin crawled. I have never been creeped out like that before. I circled the perimeter and still saw nothing. If there had been anyone there, I would have seen them. The shock I felt at that moment is indescribable. I was forced to accept that something unexplainable had happened. That shook my entire belief system. Shan had tried to warn me. At this point, the crying and murmuring just stopped, followed by dead silence. I don't know how long I stood there, unable to move. I had absolutely heard those voices, and there was nowhere to hide and nowhere to go without being seen and heard. I had no idea how to process what I had experienced. The old man told me the place was haunted. Was it? What else could it be? I walked back down the hill to the campsite. Shan was so happy to see me. He wagged his tail furiously and danced in place until I came up and petted him. We sat in the campsite, wide awake for what seemed like an eternity, waiting for dawn so we could see to walk out of there. I was terrified that something else would happen, but the rest of the night passed without incident. Sean and I left that place as soon as there was enough light to navigate the deep forest. When we made it back to town, I contacted the gentleman who had told me the story. We met a couple of days later, and I related my story. He showed no surprise and assured me that what I had experienced was indeed the ghosts of the family who had lived there. In the light of day, my rational mind wants to deny what I experienced, but I know it happened. If I ever wanted to go back to that old ruin, I think it is the one place in this world Sean would refuse to follow. He need not worry. I'm never going near that place again. I come here once more with a more recent encounter with the Dog Man, Werewolf of Hull, Old Stinker. Life recently, as I last mentioned, has been rough. Approximately 3.5 months ago, I nearly died, ending up hospitalized with severe pneumonia. I've had recurring problems with my legs that have severely hampered my mobility for the past year as well, though I seem to be on the road to recovery now. As I mentioned in my previous tale, I tend to spend a great deal of time chair-bound at my desk near one of my flat windows with a view of the street. I will openly admit, my sleeping patterns have vastly improved under very, very strict doctor's orders and a determination to overcome and get past the dreaded time when I collapsed and had to be rushed to hospital. I live on one of the many rows of terraced houses within the city, leading in toward the city center, in a house converted into a number of flats. At the end of the street is a wooded, overgrown footpath that connects and cuts through to other parts of the city, local parks, and down to the local drain. As you would expect, city life is generally loud. Nights are rarely silent. You get the odd stranger shouting up to a local weed dealer's window at all hours of the day, constantly barking dogs, yowling cats, arguments in the street. It tends to make a peaceful night's sleep something more of a dream than a reality. The night this happened, a month and a half back, was one such noisy night. I was in my chair, windows cracked open to allow some airflow and circulation through the flat duvet pulled up around me, when I found myself somewhat irritably waking at about 3:30 in the morning. I noticed two distinct things. First, a constant, persistent, and terribly annoying yapping echoing through the night from partway down the street. This came from a neighbor's dog, one of those irritating little lap breeds that, for some reason, they chose to keep in the garden as though it were a Rottweiler or Doberman and would deter burglars or anything slightly larger than an irate pigeon. Yap, 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 all day, all night, like some sort of possessed squeaky toy. Sometimes it shut up, probably when its owners took it out with them or went to visit someone. The second thing I noticed was a familiar, distinct smell, or should I say stench, wafting through the cracked open windows and into the house, causing me to cough and retch. A stench like rotting flesh mixed with trash. Not the almost musky sewage smell you sometimes get from city drains. Not the heavy stink of manure. I was familiar with those. I've lived in this city now a good 20-plus years, and prior to that, I lived in the rural Welsh countryside, working with our then landlord, who not only maintained a stable yard, but also worked as a farmer. It was great. Free child labor in return for teaching the kid how to ride a horse. So that particular stink was familiar to me as well. No, this was a stench from 20-odd years ago, when I was younger. Old stinker. He'd been in the area recently, rooting through bins, killing local wildlife, probably using the overgrown wooded footpaths as a convenient way to get about to places where he could find food or prey. And as before, everything seemed to go silent, eerily so. Like time stood still, as though everything held its breath, yap, 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 except for the dog. Nervously, I glanced out the window, leaning forward into the bit that was pushed out to glimpse down the road. The streetlights weren't great. A few were out, a few covered by the trees yet to be trimmed in full spring. But I felt my heart racing in this eerily, almost deathly silence, this unnatural moment where the world held its breath. This annoying, stupid little yapping dog seemed to be determined to mock the powers that be themselves. And what I saw caused me to shiver. I saw glimpses of an eerily familiar shaggy black shape loping along the street, investigating bins left out, nosing through trash. And it was getting closer. I turned my living room light off, holding my breath, not wanting to draw its attention. The last thing I wanted was for it to look up with those same amber eyes, those same pointed ears, and be like, "You, the one that got away." Nope, definitely not. I'll not toy with fate like that, so close to very nearly dying scant months prior. But as Stinker worked his way down the street, the yapping dog intensified and started to growl, as if that tiny little thing was about to challenge the Stinker. It would be madness, or a sign of a hyper-aggressive lap breed, which probably was just as feasible. Soon enough, the growling was echoing in the night air as the Stinker stopped outside the yapper's garden. I watched in silent horror as it stopped and rose up, its stance going from that lazy, scringy lope to almost some sort of defiant, challenging posture. If I were to describe it, do you know that not quite ape, not quite human stance Caesar takes in the newer Planet of the Apes movies, where he just towers over his opponent and squares right up to them? It was like that. The yapper barked, growling, snarling pathetic noises for its size. And what ensued? I've heard dogs fight. I've heard cats fight. It happens with ferals and strays. Normally you hear the barks, the growls. One becomes louder and is responded to with a yelp, then a clatter as they scatter and split. But this was not like that. The yapper's tiny pathetic noises of aggression were met with a deeper, more bestial rumbling growl and snarl, and then a sickening snap and crunch, and the yapping stopped cold. My stomach lurched. I felt the tiny swig of Pepsi I'd had a few hours prior with some painkillers coming back up, bile threatening to spill from my mouth, and watched in cold silence as the shadowy form of Stinker turned and started loping back toward the end of the road. Though this time, it seemed to be on 3 limbs rather than 4. I didn't need to guess what it was carrying with it. I remained silent for a good hour after that, just watching the night. I hadn't realized I'd been awake through the dreaded half hour, where I remember the moments that led to my collapse and the ambulance rushing me off to hospital. I was in a bit of shock. I dare not say anything to the neighbors down the street. What could I say? Their beloved little dog was snatched up by an 8-foot-tall dog man? I would have tried to stop it, but didn't fancy my hobbling on a cane against it. No. Instead, I guiltily watched as posters went up and other neighbors breathed sighs of relief for the yapping finally stopping. But after seeing what happened, I will admit, I have a bit of concern for the pot guy who comes across most days and nights to shout up at his dealer's window for more. I'm a hunter, living out in the bush. I couldn't believe what I shot last night. Pine needles crunched underfoot as I made my way through the underbrush. The wind bit at the nape of my neck, causing me to pull up my collar. The cold was bitter, a little too intense for this early in the fall. It forebode an early winter, one that I wasn't quite ready for. For the next month, my entire existence would be devoted to hunting and stacking wood, and I wouldn't have it any other way. After a few hours of tracking, I made my mark. A young doe gracefully twisted and twirled beneath branches, nibbling at the forest floor. She wasn't a trophy, but she would feed me for nearly a month. I went to my knee, raising my rifle and resting an elbow on my thigh. Just breathe. Upon the exhale, I counted. 1, 2, 3, boom. She dropped immediately. My heart thundered in my chest as I quickly shouldered my rifle and jogged over to her resting place. Her eyes were large and swimming with fear. I covered them with my hand, thanked her for her life, and unsheathed my knife, driving it between her rib cage. Her body went stiff, rigid for a moment, and then fell into that eternal slumber. I hummed a song my mother used to sing to me as a child as I went to work with my knife. Field dressing was, at best, a simple chore, and, at worst, full of remorse. But that was life out here, surviving from within the evergreens. The sun was nearly set by the time I was finished. The last leg of my journey back to the cabin would be in total darkness if I didn't hurry. I pulled her over my shoulders and set out at a steady jog. It was tough going, but I knew I needed to get the doe inside and the offering out on the steps before it got too late. She wouldn't accept a belated gift. I let my mind slip into that static place, the place I went to when the pain crept in, and I ground through the minutes. They passed by painfully slow as the warmth of blood from the doe soaked my back. My calves were cramping and my lungs were burning from the cold, but I made it. The cabin came into view just as the sun faded over the horizon. The next hour was a blur as I started a fire in the hearth of my home and carefully set out to extract the heart from her chest. Once it was free, I carefully wrapped it in burlap and tied baling twine around the package. Fingerprints of blood traced around the exterior of the gift, but I knew she wouldn't mind. It was heavy in my hands and somehow still a little warm as I set it out on the first step of the front porch. I scanned the tree line, looking for signs of her, but saw only darkness between the trunks. A wolf howled in the distance, cutting through the silence of the night. My breath poured out like smoke into the air. Winter truly was on its way, and I wasn't ready. The next 3 weeks passed by entirely too quickly. I'd stacked plenty of wood behind the cabin, sure, but staying warm just to starve to death was a moot point. Since the doe, I'd only been able to trap some wild snowshoe hares and bring down a few geese. So when I awoke to the first snowfall of the season this morning, panic began to stir in my gut. I decided to double down on my hunting efforts, seeking out new game trails for trapping and spending my entire afternoons with my rifle in the forest. Hopelessness was starting to set in just before I finally saw movement in the brush up ahead. My heartbeat pulsed in my neck and my mouth went dry. Something was beating through the shrubbery. I couldn't tell what it was, but it was loud and borderline obnoxious. Perhaps a young black bear that hadn't mastered the hunt yet. Bear meat was grim, but it held plenty of fat that could sustain me for weeks. I pushed down my excitement, stifling it in my stomach, and slipped my rifle from my shoulder. I watched as limbs shook and leaves fluttered, until finally, I caught sight of what I thought was its head. I aimed about a foot down and a few inches to the right, where I thought the heart and lungs would be. Breathe. 1, 2, 3. Boom. A cry rang out just after the shot, one that sounded wrong. I couldn't place the noise, but it certainly wasn't from a black bear. I furrowed my brow and slung the rifle over my shoulder before taking off through the brush. After breaking through thorns and entanglements of vines, I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart, which had thundered like a war drum, suddenly felt like it had stopped beating in my chest. "Oh my God," I croaked. It was a man. He was covered head to toe in camouflage, with his own gun in tow. Blood pooled around his body, saturating the snow in crimson. I pulled my glove off and reached down to check for a pulse, but found none. The shot had struck true and had been fatal. I spent the next hour muttering prayers, asking for forgiveness, and creating a makeshift sled from the brush using my hatchet. Once it was done, I carefully rolled the man onto it and strapped him on with the belt from around my waist. I dragged him back to the cabin, once again going to that static place. Not to avoid the pain, but because my mind was reeling with shock and disbelief. The sun was setting by the time I'd gotten him inside. After looking through his belongings, I'd found his wallet and ID. Liam Forer from Toronto. What in the hell was he doing way out here? I fired up the ham radio and got a hold of the authorities out in Fairbanks. We both assumed he was a tourist hunting on a big game license. The officer said it sounded like an accident and that these things happen, but that didn't erase the guilt that constricted my chest. They would be out after first light on a puddle jumper to investigate and retrieve the body. I reached for the bottle of whiskey I had hidden above the cupboards. It had been so long since I'd had any that I had to wipe off a thick layer of dust from the cap. I didn't bother with a glass. I drank until I was numb and fell asleep by the fire, curled up on the hardwood floor with a prayer still on my lips. I awoke to what sounded like a whisper in my ear, a sinister sound that scratched around at the base of my skull. I opened my eyes, my vision swimming. There was a scratching. It sounded like nails on glass. I rolled to the side just in time to see something dark run past the window. I froze, adrenaline coursing through my veins like fire, but I couldn't move. It couldn't be. The flames flickered, casting shadows of a hand on the ceiling, long fingers spread like deciduous branches above. "No, no, no," I whispered. She couldn't have expected an offering from this. The front door rattled violently in its frame. "This is a human being, for Christ's sake, not an animal," I cried. The door fell silent. This was not a hunt. It was an accident. He was a man. This is not in our agreement. It was quiet for so long that I thought maybe she had gone, but suddenly I heard footsteps from above. Heavy footfalls thundered across the roof. She wasn't going to stop. I knew she wouldn't. The Witch of the Woods cared nothing for my moral dilemma and demanded her offering. I'd made a kill in her forest, and payment was due. I looked over to Mr. Forer with tears welling in my eyes. I could hear the splintering of wooden studs from above as she threatened to come through the ceiling. I'd been a survivalist for so long that I just couldn't bring myself to lie down and die now. I hummed a song I used to hear in church as a child and went to work with my knife. Field dressing was, at best, a simple chore, and at worst, full of remorse. And this time, I was drowning in it. But that was life out here, surviving from within the evergreens. You did what you had to stay alive. I was never the type to go on road trips, but when my friend invited me to go on a fishing trip to Arkansas, I told him I was down to go. I've been fishing since I was a little boy, when my dad first taught me how to cast my bait, and I've always dreamed of catching big trout in Arkansas. The camp we'd be staying at is called Newlands. We're aiming to leave late Saturday. The time we leave all depends on my dad, Jude told me. I found it strange that we were leaving late because the drive there would be 8 hours. I guess in my mind it made sense, because the later you stay out, the less traffic there would be. So, on Friday night, I packed my things and slept in late. In the afternoon, when Jude and his father came to pick me up, I kissed my parents goodbye and told them I loved them. I woke up about halfway through the car ride. Through my tired and blurry vision, I was able to make out the words on a road sign, thanks to our headlights reflecting off it. It read, "Urgent message for traveler info. Tune into 1680 AM. "That's an interesting sign," I said tiredly to Jude. "Yeah, it's weird. That wasn't there last time we came," Jude replied. Jude's father tuned into the AM channel without saying a word. At first, there was silence. That silence was somehow loud and eerie. Then the staticky voice began playing. "Warning, do not fall asleep. They're here. Reports of river crawlers seen in northern Arkansas from the hours of 10 p.m. to 12 a.m. Do not fall asleep. Do not look outside. If you hear scratching in the ceiling, don't look up. Lock your doors. If someone is knocking on your door during the hours previously mentioned, do not open it. If you hear screaming from outside your cabin, do not go outside. If someone leaves your cabin during those hours, do not let them back in until lockdown has been lifted. In the case where something from outside breaches your cabin, lock yourselves inside a room and turn off the lights. Stay tuned for more updates." The message ended. The car was left in silence. "Was that real?" Jude said, but was cut off abruptly. "Boys, as long as you listen to me, we're going to be okay," Jude's dad said calmly. We both nodded. When we got there, it was early Sunday morning. We fished the whole day and ate what we caught. I caught my first rainbow trout. I spent a few hours catching plenty of fish. I caught everything I ever dreamed of, rainbows, browns, brooks, and even a tiger trout. The river was plentiful, and I was proud of myself. But soon it was dark, and with the dark, I remembered that radio message. Before I could recall everything that was said, Jude's dad called us into the cabin. When we went inside, the lights were off and the blinds shut. Jude's dad locked all three of us in one bedroom and turned on his lantern. "We're going to be in here for 2 hours and 30 minutes. I'm not chancing it," he said sternly. "Dad, you're scaring me," Jude said, teary-eyed. "We're going to be okay, son. Just be silent. Keep your heads down at the floor. Just trust me," he said with a soft smile. Thank God we listened to him. Seeing Jude emotional wasn't something I saw often, so I knew he was genuinely afraid. And that's when the sounds started. First, it was the footsteps from outside. At first, they were soft and you could barely hear them. The footsteps were getting louder. I could feel Jude shaking next to me. And then there was silence. That silence was broken by screams. "Please, help me," a woman called. "They're here. Please, let me in," the voice cried. The voice had a dark undertone, making it sound like something was mimicking her. Then the banging on our front door started. "Let me in. Please," the woman sobbed. The banging continued for another minute. It felt like my head was being shaken around by the loud noises from the front door. Whatever it was wanted us to believe it was in agony. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence returned, followed by footsteps and then scratching. It was coming from the roof. "Don't look up. Don't look up," was all I could think. It stopped, then continued, then stopped again. It was like it was toying with us, begging us to look up at the source of the sound, begging us to check if it had truly stopped. And then the radio in our room turned on. "Urgent message. Lockdown has been lifted. You are free to roam again. Stay tuned in for updates." I looked at the clock. 11:50 p.m. Jude began to stand up when his father grabbed him and motioned for him to sit still. So he did. That's when the front door burst open with a loud slam. It sounded as if the door came off its hinges. Then something began slamming all its weight on the door we were hiding behind. We all scooted back into the corner of the room. The creature screeched, and the door gave in. A tall, black creature on all fours bent down to enter the room. Jude's dad put his hands over our mouths. I was shaking uncontrollably. The creature had strange appendages coming out of its back. It had lanky body parts, skinny arms, skinny legs, and a slim oval-shaped head. Its jaw unhinged. It had no eyes. It was roaming strictly off of hearing. When it couldn't find us, I watched it contort itself. The crunch of bones echoed in my ears. Right before my eyes, I watched the grotesque being turn into a beautiful woman. It had dark brown hair with a slim body. The most noticeable feature was its deep blue eyes. They were bluer than any ocean on Earth. And then it left. Midnight came. True silence returned. In that small corner, we fell asleep. When morning came, we checked out the damage. The cabin was trashed. Blood from the creature's contortion act was left in a small pool in my room. The front door was unhinged, just as I suspected. The cabin next to us was less fortunate. Yellow tape outlined the entire building, which was in worse shape than ours. When I took a glimpse inside from a distance, blood was everywhere. It covered every wall. Small bits of entrails littered the floor. Bits of flesh and brains were all over the front porch. There were no signs of life in the cabin. We packed our bags that same day and we left. That was the last day we stayed, and I told myself I would never come back. I used my phone to do research on the creature that invaded our cabin during the drive back home. When I searched river crawler, a Wikipedia page came up. The river crawlers of northern Arkansas is an urban legend from hundreds of years ago. They are said to have lived in the deepest part of Bull Shoals Lake. When the dam was opened to let water out due to flooding, the river crawlers made their way into the White River. To this day, that's where they reside. Over time, they have adapted to technology. They can manipulate time, manipulate technology, and take the form of any humans they kill. The easiest way to spot them is their abnormally blue eyes. They mostly lurk during the night and cannot survive in sunlight for long. It burns their thin skin and causes them to melt. I finished reading this in awe. Take form of any humans they kill. I went to the Newlands obituary. I looked at the most recent deaths in the town, and there I saw her. A beautiful woman, dark brown hair, slim body, honey brown eyes.